All right, so we are going to get started. We want to be very respectful of your time, and we have an amazing and exciting program. So at this moment in time, I am going to invite up to the stage my president of the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, Faye Twersky. Give it up for Faye.
Okay. Thank you, Danny. Good afternoon, everybody. We had, I guess, a few parking snafus, so there may be a few folks, it actually looks like you mostly got here, so, but we may have a few folks joining, coming in late just to some parking snafus. I'm Faye Twersky, the president of the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation, for those of you I don't know, although I know most of you, I'm happy to say, in this room. On behalf of Arthur Blank, the Blank Family Foundation, the Blank family of businesses, I want to welcome you all to this Economic Mobility Summit. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today, for driving here, for flying here, for parking here and making your way to this room. We're hosting this summit because economic mobility is important to the foundation. One of our collective giving areas that the family adopted about a little over 5 years ago, we call youth development. It's one of our 5 priority areas. Youth development is a little bit of a misnomer because it really is economic mobility for young people. That is a core area for us. It's important to us. Economic mobility in Atlanta and in Georgia. And that is really why we are hosting the summit today. We have designed the summit in 3 parts. First part is we're going to hear from Dr. Chetty. And he is going to share with us the state of economic mobility, both in our nation and also in our region, in the metro Atlanta region. We'll hear more about him in a moment. Second part is we're going to learn from a sister city, from Charlotte, about how they really changed the trajectory in economic mobility for the citizens of Charlotte. And we have a lot to learn from them, and that will be, I think, a great presentation. And then after we hear from both Raj and Sherry Chisholm about Charlotte, we'll have a Q&A with the 2 of them together with you. So if you have questions about Raj's data, you have questions about what Sherry's presenting about Charlotte, we'll have some time to have open Q&A with all of you. And then finally, the third part will focus right here at home, at what the city of Atlanta and the metro Atlanta region is doing to really increase mobility for the citizens in this region. And we'll have some terrific presenters from the city and from organizations in this city. We'll hear from the city of Atlanta, from Blue Meridian Partners, the Atlanta Committee for Progress, and Purpose-Built Communities. We're going to power through the next 2 hours and 20 minutes. We are not going to take a bio break, so there are restrooms over there. There are restrooms over there, so if you need to get up, just take care of yourself as we go into the next couple of hours together. We have so many amazing people here today, from government, from business, from the nonprofit world, from funders. I can't acknowledge everybody, but I want to acknowledge we have some elected officials here today, and I want to thank you for being here with us. If some of the elected officials can stand. Thank you. I want to acknowledge Raj Chetty's family came here to be here with us today. Really lovely to have them. And I'm not going to ask you all to stand, but just thank you for being here. They're in the back of the room there to hear Raj's presentation. And then, as you know, this has been great to see so many of you. An event like this does not happen without a lot of help. And a lot of people were responsible for putting this together. And you'll just stay with me for about 30 seconds because I want to make a few thank yous to making this event happen, starting with Danny Shoy and Casey Anderson. They've been working on this for a long time, and it's really because of them that you are all here. But there are many other people, our friends from Philanthropy Southeast who helped us with invitations, Dina Chadwick and Tiffany Friesen. We also got help from Alexis Jordan, Kelly Gully, Lauren Lawrence, Jice Murphy, Christian Amica, Patricia Wiggum, Beth Brown, Taisha Short, Vanessa Tucker, Margaret Connolly, Sherry Mazer, Lara Fawaz, the Levy Caterers, Room Set Up, and more. So thank you to everybody. We're so appreciative of all of your help. And now on to introducing Dr. Chetty. Raj Chetty is a professor of economics and the director of Opportunity Insights at Harvard. Before that, he had posts at Stanford and at UC Berkeley. He got his PhD from Harvard and is one of the youngest tenured professors at Harvard. I first encountered Raj when he published his first really groundbreaking study in 2014. And at that time, we called it the study about could you achieve the American dream? That was some of the ways that we talked about that, and I think maybe Raj talked about it that way too. He used big data sets to look at the possibility of economic mobility in this nation, looking at the 50 largest cities and what those possibilities were. And his research revealed huge differences in upward mobility for people. I remember then that there were some surprises in that study, and one of them had to do with, the different schools that you went to. For me, this was a big surprise. The different schools that you went to, and which school helped you be more upwardly mobile, and which maybe a little less. I won't be a spoiler here because I know Raj is going to talk about that in a little while. But the main thing that his study did for me back in 2014 was it really made me question my assumptions about how mobility worked. And that was something I had studied, I had looked into, but Raj had kind of a new take on it, and it really made me think afresh. And I hope and I expect that that's what's going to happen today, as 10 years later, Dr. Chetty refreshed his study. In his early study, Metro Atlanta, out of 50 cities, we ranked 49th. He refreshed the study, and I won't tell you now where we rank. We'll let him show you. But what I so appreciate about Raj is his uncanny ability to make complex ideas simple. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Raj to the stage. Put this.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Faye, for the warm introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here in Atlanta with all of you, and especially special for me because both of my sisters are actually professors here at Emory, and so my parents are visiting them as well, and so it's a family event to be here for us. So I'm going to share some slides here. I'm just going to swap the clicker out. And I'm going to talk about changes that we can make in our local institutions and local communities to improve people's chances of rising up. But I want to start at a much bigger picture level by talking about the American dream, which is, of course, a multifaceted, complex concept that has different meanings to different people. But I want to distill it in this first chart here to one cornerstone aspect of the American dream, the idea that through hard work, any child should have the chance to move up in the income distribution relative to their parents. It was certainly that kind of aspiration that drew my own parents to come to this country and countless other immigrants. And so in a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration we measured the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And what you can see is that if you look at kids born in the middle of the last century, back in 1940, for example, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. We estimate that 92% of children born in 1940 went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born around 1990 who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults, it's become basically a 50-50 shot, a coin flip, as to whether you're going to achieve the American dream of moving up. So this dramatic trend is of course of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the US economy that we'd like to understand. But I would argue that this trend is also fundamental social and political interest because it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead, even through hard work. So motivated by this trend, in our research group at Harvard that I direct, Opportunity Insights, we're interested in understanding what is driving the fading of the American dream, and more importantly, what can we do going forward to expand opportunities for people throughout America to rise up. Now, we are, of course, by no means the first group of researchers to study these questions. People have been interested in issues of economic mobility and development for hundreds of years. Our angle on it, as Faye mentioned in her introduction, is to use the tools of modern big data to study these questions with the newfound precision that's available to us. And so to show you how that works, let me now break down this kind of national analysis by starting to look at a more local level, by showing you what the geography of economic opportunity looks like here across the United States. So let me first take a second to describe how we construct the map that I'm showing you, and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we're doing here is using data on 20 million children, essentially all children born in the late 1970s, early 1980s in the United States. We get information from anonymized tax returns that allows us to link those kids back to their parents and back to the exact location in which they grew up. We then divide the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. And in each of those areas, we calculate a very simple measure of upward economic mobility. We ask, if you grew up in a low-income family, that's a family at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, which puts you at an income of about $27,000 a year, we ask, suppose you grew up in such a family and we follow you over time and look at your own income based on your 1040 tax return when you're 35 years old, how much are you making on average? So to give you an example, in the Boston metro area, where I'm from, kids who grew up in families making $27,000 a year, when we look at them when they're age 35, they're on average making about $37,000 a year. Now you can similarly construct that statistic for every different metro and rural area in the United States, and we color the map so that the red colors represent places where kids are less likely to rise up and achieve the American dream, and the green colors represent places where you're more likely to rise up and achieve the American dream. So if you start by looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this chart, you can see that there's an enormous amount of variation in children's chances of rising up in different parts of America. So there's some parts of America, like the rural Midwest, take a place like Dubuque, Iowa, for example. Kids growing up in families making $27,000 a year, one generation later are making $45,000 or $50,000 a year on average. So that's a significant amount of upward income mobility in a single generation. Yet there are other places, like much of the Southeast and Atlanta and Charlotte in particular, as you can see, where you're starting out in families at that exact same income level of $27,000 a year, but unfortunately one generation later, on average, it doesn't look like kids are doing any better than their parents were when they're in their 30s, which is shocking if you think about it, if you think about the amount of economic growth that's occurred in the nation as a whole over the past 30, 35 years, and in particular, as you all know, in the city of Atlanta, in the city of Charlotte. Now, Faye mentioned that we have been looking at these statistics over time. This map comes from that original study that we did on the land of opportunity you noticed back in 2014, where you mentioned, Charlotte ranked 50th out of the 50 largest cities in America at that time in children's chances of rising up. Atlanta was 49th. Now, what has happened since, and Sherry will talk about this, is that Atlanta, unfortunately, now is 50th out of 50 in our most recent data. And Charlotte has risen up quite a bit into the 30s, and there's been significant progress in terms of economic mobility in Charlotte. And Sherry will talk about some of what has driven that favorable news in Charlotte, and hopefully can be replicated in Atlanta and other parts of the country. So in this big map here, your eye naturally gravitates to the broad regional variation across the United States. You see that if you're born to a low-income family, you have a better chance of escaping poverty in the rural Midwest, parts of the coasts, and so on, much lower in the Southeast and cities in the industrial Midwest like Cleveland and Detroit and so forth. But it turns out, in terms of understanding what is going on here, the variation in terms of children's chances in economic mobility actually arises at a much finer geographic level. So in subsequent work, what we were able to do is drill down and start to look at these data, not just at the national level, but at a much more local level. So now what we've done is using a tool called the Opportunity Atlas, which is a website you can go to yourself. You just take your phone or your computer, type Opportunity Atlas, or go to opportunityatlas.org. You can type in your home address, and you can look at the same kind of statistics that I'm showing you here, taking a snapshot of that website for the city of Atlanta. And you can look at the same kind of data. What are children's chances of rising up in different parts of the city? Now, what we've done here is zoomed in to Atlanta. And the first point I want to make, which is a very simple one, is that we have not changed the color scale in this map. But what you can see is that the spectrum of colors that you see looks pretty much the same as what you saw on the national map. So what is that telling you? You can go a few miles down the road in Atlanta from the southwest side of the city to the northeast side of the city. And it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of your children's chances of rising up out of poverty. So we find this pattern in Atlanta, we find this pattern in every city we look at across America. The roots of these differences in economic mobility are hyper-local. It's not about what's happening in one state versus another state or one city versus another city. Often it's about differences on one side of the street versus another side of the street. And that simple observation is extremely important because it suggests that if we want to tackle this problem, we need to think about solutions that matter at a very local level. You might think about things like the types of schools that kids are attending or who they're interacting with, not just state or federal level policies. So this is the view in Atlanta itself. You can see, you're all much more familiar with the neighborhoods than I am, and you can see what the patterns look like. Of course, you can look at the same statistics at different geographies. So if you go to that website, the Opportunity Atlas, I know some of you are from the greater Atlanta metro area, and you can see similar patterns where there are parts of Atlanta where if you happen to be from a low-income family and are able to afford housing in some of these places, your chances of rising up look as good as anywhere in America. But then unfortunately, there are other pockets, many other pockets of this area where you have some of the lowest chances of escaping poverty anywhere in the United States. So what I'm interested in, what I'm going to focus on in this talk is how we can help children rise up in terms of economic mobility. And I'm going to focus as a main outcome on how much people are earning. But even economists recognize that income is not the only thing that we care about. There are many other outcomes that matter as well. And I want to show before moving on that it's nevertheless makes sense to focus on upward mobility in terms of earnings as a primary metric because income tends to be correlated with lots of other things that people care about. So let me give you one example that I think is especially relevant in the city of Atlanta, leader in healthcare and health research, CDC and Emory and so on. So here's some data from another paper our team released some time ago published in the journal JAMA, where we look at the link between life expectancy and income using data on all Americans, drawn from tax records linked to Social Security records. So you have billions of records of information on mortality rates and income. And what we're doing is taking a set of people who are 40 years old and asking, how long are you expected to live based on your current income? So there are 100 dots here, one for each percentile of the income distribution. Lowest income folks on the left, the top 1% of the income distribution in the dot on the far right. And you can see that there's an enormous difference in life expectancy based on your income in the US. So for people in the top 1% of the income distribution, if you look at men, for example, you're expected to live about 15 years longer than the lowest income men in the United States. So just to give you a sense of that magnitude, the CDC estimates that if we were to eliminate cancer as a cause of death, life expectancy would go up by 3.2 years in the United States. So compare that to the 15-year gap between the lowest and highest income men in the US. That shows you how important these socioeconomic differences are. And we find in the kinds of studies I'm about to describe to you in more detail, if we create environments where people have more economic mobility, we correspondingly also see better health outcomes. We see a variety of other better outcomes. So it all goes kind of hand in hand. And this underscores, I think, the importance of the issues we're all talking about today. So having set the stage in that way on what the state of economic mobility looks like in the United States and in Atlanta in particular, I want to divide this talk into 3 parts. First, I want to tell you about what we've learned about what's driving these differences in economic mobility, about the science of economic opportunity, essentially, that's developed over the past 10 years since that study our team released. I'll then talk about how we can take that scientific understanding and make changes in policy at a local level in order to improve people's outcomes going forward, what brings us all here and motivates us all. And then finally, in the third section, I'll talk about some new work our team is doing on how to finance and measure the impacts of those interventions, which I think is critical to be able to scale effective programs to promote economic mobility. So let me start by telling you about what we've learned about the determinants of economic mobility, giving you a quick overview by first describing a study we did where we looked at 5 million families that moved across neighborhoods in the United States. And rather than getting into the statistical details of that study, what I'm going to do is illustrate what we found in the context of a simple example, picking 2 neighborhoods here in Atlanta. I want you to think about a set of families who start out living in Carver Hills, which you can see here is in a dark red color. It's a place where kids who are born to low-income families have relatively poor odds of rising out of poverty. And imagine a set of families that move from Carver Hills to Hanover West, which is a very nearby neighborhood, which you see is in a much more green color, where children achieve much better outcomes when they start out in low-income families. So imagine a set of families who make this move with kids of different ages, starting with families who move when their child is exactly 2 years old. So what we're doing in that first dot that you see plotted there is tracking those kids who move when they're 2 years old and asking how much did they themselves make when we measure their incomes when they're 30 years old using their tax data. And you can see that for the kids who move from Carver Hills to Hanover West when they're exactly 2, they're earning on average about $33,700 a year when we see them at age 30. So that's for the children who move when they're exactly 2. Now let's repeat this analysis, looking at children who move when they are 3, 4, 5, and so on, make that exact same move. What you can see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you move from Carver Hills to Hanover West, or more generally from a red-colored neighborhood on the map to a green-colored neighborhood, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat, and you get no gain at all. So what do you see from this chart? I think there are 3 key takeaways. The first is that where you grow up really matters. Place matters. It's not just that the kinds of kids who live in Carver Hills are different from the kinds of kids who live in Hanover West. Apparently, if you take a given kid and move that kid to a different environment, they do dramatically better in terms of their economic outcomes, in terms of their health outcomes, and so on. So I see that as a really encouraging message. It shows that you don't have to look back to the 1950s to find a period of high economic mobility. Actually, you can just look a couple miles down the road, and if you can help replicate that environment, you can achieve great success. That shows you that this problem is actually changeable. Second, what you see is that what really matters is childhood environment, not necessarily where you're living as an adult once you've entered the labor market. So we see that when you help adults move to different areas, that doesn't necessarily change their outcomes in this and many other studies. When kids move to different places, you see really dramatic changes in their outcomes. The third thing you see, to make a medical analogy, is that there's basically a dosage effect here. Every extra year that you spend growing up in a better environment, the better you do in the long run. So if you move when you're 5 instead of 10 or 10 instead of 15, every extra year kind of counts and helps you do better in the long run. That point is important in the context of current policy discussions because it suggests that it's not just the early childhood environment that matters a lot. There's a lot of emphasis on things like universal preschool and programs like that. We think that can be very valuable, but you see from these data that improving kids' environments, even when they're adolescents or beyond when they're entering college, continues to remain quite valuable. So environment matters continuously from birth to early adulthood. So having established that the environment which you're growing up is really important, the natural next question that you're probably wondering about is, what's different about the green-colored places that we've been looking at in the maps that I've been showing you from the red-colored places? If we can figure that out, maybe we can replicate that recipe in other parts of Atlanta, other parts of America, and that would help many people rise up. So this is now a very active field of research in economics and other adjacent fields, using the data that our team has put out in the Opportunity Atlas, correlating those measures with lots of different characteristics of areas. In the interest of time, I'm going to summarize here the 4 strongest predictors that we and others have identified of determinants of economic mobility using these data. The first is lower poverty rates. So we find that more mixed income communities where low and high income people are living together rather than concentrated poverty tend to be places where people are more likely to rise out of poverty. Second, places with more stable family structures, more two-parent families in particular, tend to be places where kids are more likely to rise up. Third, as you might expect intuitively, places with better schools, both at the K through 12 level and in terms of access to higher education, tend to be places with higher levels of upward mobility. And finally, places with greater social capital tend to be places with higher levels of upward mobility. Now, this idea of social capital, that term is one you might have heard. It's been used in lots of different contexts for more than 100 years. It's been used to mean many different things. So some people mean the strength of connections that people have, what the community looks like, how much people trust each other. But it's the kind of concept that I think people have intuitively thought matters a great deal, but has been very hard to measure and pin down precisely. So this is, again, a place where modern big data can really allow us to make advances. And so I want to spend an extra minute on social capital, both because that's an area where we've been able to make some progress in understanding how it works, but also because it turns out, even among these 4 factors, I would say this may be the most important thing to focus on in terms of improving economic mobility. So to show you how we get to that conclusion, let me show you this pair of maps here, where the map on the left is the same map I started out with, constructed using tax record data, which shows you rates of upward income mobility, right, in this case, county by county, colored in the same way that we discussed. The map on the right looks visually very similar, but it's completely different. It's a map constructed using Facebook data, where we set up a collaboration with Facebook to analyze the friendship patterns of 72 million Americans between the ages of 25 and 44. And we constructed various different measures of social capital. And here we're focusing on one of those measures that we call economic connectedness, which is a very simple measure of how much low-income people are interacting with high-income people in their community. So specifically what we're measuring is, among people with below median income on Facebook, what fraction of their Facebook friends have above median income? And in the map on the right, the red colors are places where low-income people have very few high-income contacts and friends, and the green colors are places where there's more cross-class interaction and connection. So you can see the key result here immediately for yourself. You don't need any fancy statistics. It's immediately obvious that the map on the right looks incredibly similar to the map on the left. This turns out to be the single strongest predictor of economic mobility that we or anybody else has identified, both at the national level, as you see here, and at the local level. So if we zoom into Atlanta, and again, you can look at these data on our website, zip code by zip code in Atlanta, you can see it's exactly in the zip codes where low-income people have very few high-income connections that they are least likely to rise up out of poverty. And in the places that are more connected across class lines, you have higher rates of economic mobility. Now, these are correlational results. In ongoing work, we actually find that there's a strong causal link between who you're connected to and your chances of rising up using random variation in who your peers are and who you're connected to while you're growing up. We see that if you happen to have more high-income connections, you're more likely to go to college, you're more likely to have a high level of earnings, and so on. And this turns out to be a very strong factor, not just in a predictive sense, but in a causal sense in shaping people's opportunities. So that gives you a quick sense of what we've learned, and it's just kind of scratching the surface of hundreds of papers that have been written about the determinants of economic opportunity. You can see that local environment matters at a very granular level, where you grow up, things like the schools you attend, who you're connected to, and so on. So what I want to do next is show how we can take this scientific understanding and use it to better inform policies to increase economic mobility going forward, to actually change people's lives on the ground. And the way our team is organizing the work we're doing in the policy space is by focusing on 3 different areas that I think naturally follow from the scientific understanding that we've developed that I just shared with you. So in particular, to summarize in a nutshell what I've shown you so far, we think the determinants of economic opportunity are hyperlocal, and they're about childhood environment and factors like social capital and so on. So if you have that view of the world, I think you would naturally think about 3 different approaches to increase economic mobility going forward. The first is to reduce segregation. So if I know that there are better opportunities to be had in one part of Atlanta versus another, maybe I can help more low-income families move to those higher opportunity neighborhoods. Maybe I can make the city less segregated by income through affordable housing policies and so on. And that is, I think, a feasible approach that we can implement on some scale, and I'll show you some data on that in a second. A second approach is to recognize that while helping people move to opportunity in some sense can be one viable solution, it's not fully scalable. You can't move everyone from one part of Atlanta to another part of Atlanta. And so at the end of the day, you've got to think about how you can turn the red-colored neighborhoods into green-colored neighborhoods. And you can think of that as a problem of place-based investment. How can you transform communities that are currently low opportunity into higher opportunity areas? And I'll talk about some new work that our team is doing in that space that looks very encouraging. And then finally, after age 18, the key touch point for most kids is not the home in which they grow up, but the institution of higher education they might attend. And I think that there's a lot that we can do in our higher education system to make it more effective in promoting economic mobility. So let me spend a few minutes talking about each of these in turn, starting with the reducing segregation approach. So I'm going to go back to the map of Atlanta from the Opportunity Atlas that I showed you before. And what we're doing here is overlaying in the black dots the most common places where people receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. So as a bit of institutional context, you might know that in the United States, we spend nearly $70 billion a year on various affordable housing programs, the largest component of which are housing choice vouchers that give about 2.5 million families rental assistance to rent housing that's more stable and better neighborhoods that might give them a chance of rising out of poverty. So if you look at this map, you might notice a puzzling pattern, which is that those black dots are concentrated in the red parts of Atlanta, despite the fact that these families are getting substantial amount of money to find housing in whatever neighborhood they'd like. They are remaining in the highest poverty, lowest opportunity parts of the city. That is true not just in Atlanta, but in cities across the United States. Here's another example from the other side of the country, in Seattle, where our team has done some work, where you see the same kind of pattern you see in Atlanta, where there's some higher opportunity areas, some lower opportunity neighborhoods. And you look at where the housing voucher holders live, and they are concentrated exactly in the red and orange colored parts of the city, not the green colored parts where we see from the work I just shared with you that families are more likely to break out of poverty. So when we put out the Opportunity Atlas census tract level data a few years ago, a number of housing authorities approached us and said, why are we seeing this puzzling pattern? Is there something that we can do about it? Why aren't families using these resources to move to higher opportunity places? And so what came out of that is a collaboration we set up with the Seattle and King County housing authorities called Creating Moves to Opportunity, which was a randomized trial involving about 1,000 families, where we tested what I now essentially think of as a social capital intervention. We basically gave families support in the housing search process when they received these vouchers, to help them find housing in a higher opportunity neighborhood if they wanted to do so. So in particular, what that looked like was a counselor who would help support you through the search process, identify units in particular neighborhoods, say, maybe this works for you, given where your job is, where your family lives, this could be a good option. connecting people to landlords and helping them negotiate with landlords, and giving people a little bit of short-term financial assistance if you need money to pay a security deposit or an application fee. So think of it as just someone to shepherd you through the housing search process in the same way that you have brokers help you at the high end of the housing market. Set this up as a randomized trial by a flip of a coin. Half the families got access to this additional service. The other families did not. We follow them over time, look at where they choose to live, and here's the result. In the control group that simply got the housing voucher, only 14% of families ended up moving to one of those green-colored high opportunity areas. In the treatment group, that number jumps up to more than 50%. So there's a dramatic change in where families choose to live. In effect, you're starting to desegregate the city at some level. And to underscore the magnitudes here, let me note that this intervention of providing the social capital support is not inexpensive. It cost about $2,500 a family. But that is a very small number when compared with the incremental impact we estimate this is going to have. The kids who got lucky and ended up in the green bar and moved to these higher opportunity places, we estimate based on our prior work, are going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes relative to the kids in the control group who ended up staying in the lower opportunity areas. So that $2,500 of incremental spending unlocks $200,000 of returns in terms of higher earnings down the road. That is a case, this is one, I think, of many cases, turns out, where evidence is actually quite informative in terms of shaping policy. So we were encouraged that after we put out this data, the Housing and Urban Development Agency recognized this, and Congress authorized about $75 million to replicate what we did in Seattle with bipartisan sponsors, to do that in 8 other cities in America. Again, set up as randomized trials, and that analysis was recently released looking at the effects of those randomized trials, and people find in many other cities as well that there's a dramatic increase in the set of families moving to higher opportunity places when you provide the social support. And so eventually, I think there could be an expansion of these kinds of supports and these kinds of programs that would benefit many children going forward. One example of how infusing this kind of understanding into the policy space can really make a difference. So while this approach, I think, is quite promising, as I mentioned earlier, it's obviously not scalable in and of itself. You're not going to get everyone to simply move to opportunity. And so I want to talk next about what I think actually might be a more scalable approach going forward. It's harder to do, but has greater promise, and that's place-based investment. So I'm going to talk here about a new study that our team will put out next week, actually, and you might see it in the media and the New York Times and Wall Street Journal at that time. That studies the biggest effort in the United States to revitalize neighborhoods, what's called the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program. A number of folks here are actually involved in this program going back to its early days. And so to give you an example, Hope 6 happened here in Atlanta. Here's one concrete example of that. So there was a housing project, one of the first housing projects in the United States, actually, called the Techwood Homes, shown in the photo on the left. Over time, it fell into disrepair. It was a very high poverty place, afflicted by high levels of crime and so on. In the Hope 6 Neighborhood Revitalization Program, what happened was they tore down the Techwood Homes and they built mixed income housing, as what's now called Centennial Place apartments in Atlanta in the 1990s, shown on the right. And so, as some of you might know, at the time, this was incredibly controversial because lots of people got displaced. You were tearing down housing. Lots of people had to leave those homes. It was very disruptive. But the hope was, by creating this mixed income community, you might benefit future generations. Now, despite spending billions of dollars on this program and been under great scrutiny, we haven't really known to date whether it worked. Did it actually improve kids' outcomes in the long run? You have to let time elapse to be able to study that. You have to have the right data. You have to have the right methods. And so in this new study that we'll be releasing, we have linked data from the Housing and Urban Development Agency to tax records to be able to study hundreds of thousands of kids' lives, to analyze the effects of this program, essentially ask what happens to a child if you happen to grow up in exactly the same place when it looked like it did on the left versus on the right. And let me show you what we found with a couple of simple charts. So we'll start here. So what I want you to think about in understanding this chart is, imagine you're looking at a place that is ultimately revitalized with a Hope 6 revitalization grant at the point shown by that vertical dashed line. What we're plotting here, if you look at the dot at -10, is the average earnings of kids who grew up, take the set of kids who grew up in this public housing project 10 years before it was revitalized, follow them until they're 30 years old, and measure how much money they're making on average using tax data. The answer is about $25,000. The same is true for the kids who were living there 9 years before it was revitalized, 8 years before it was revitalized. There's basically no trend there, right? Now, let's look at what happens to the kids who grew up after revitalization. And you can see that there's a dramatic change in the earnings trajectories of the children who are growing up in exactly the same place post-revitalization. To give you a sense of magnitudes, if you look at the dots on the far right, that looks like about a $4,000 or $5,000 increase in income, roughly a 20% increase in income. That actually understates the magnitude of the impact because, as some of you might know, there's a lot of turnover in low-income housing. So many of these kids were only exposed to these better environments for 4 or 5 years of their childhood. We estimate in additional analysis that if kids were to grow up from birth in one of these revitalized areas instead of the unrevitalized place, they would earn about 50% more over their lifetimes, which would translate to a $500,000 increase in their lifetime incomes. So Hope 6 was very expensive, $17 billion upfront, cost $170,000 per unit to revitalize. But again, if you look at the net benefits in the long run, it really pays off. You dramatically end up changing kids' lives down the road, and it shows that place-based transformation is, in fact, quite feasible. Now, this is a very significant investment, right? You're literally tearing down housing projects, building new communities, building mixed income areas. It would be great to be able to do that on scale, but there may be limited resources to do that. I also want to show that that is not necessarily the only way to create, to make place-based investments. Let me give you another example. So in some other work that folks on our team have been doing, been studying another very different program called Communities in Schools, which is a student support program, again in this theme of providing social capital, social supports. And so in this case, they do things like academic tutoring, provide mental health counseling, engage with families when they're going through hardship. Think of it as wraparound services, not literally changing teachers or the curriculum in a school, but other things that support students in school. And I'll skip the details here, but with a similar kind of analysis to what I showed you with Hope 6, they conclude that this program also has quite significant effects on increasing kids' incomes down the road with a less invasive approach, right? You're not tearing things down and literally rebuilding communities. So these are some examples showing you that place-based transformation is possible. I think there's much more to be learned on exactly the most efficient ways to do this. But my take from these recent studies is you can take the lowest opportunity neighborhoods and turn them into higher opportunity places. And often the key mechanism that really matters comes back to social connection. So if we go back to Hope 6, we see that the key driver of those changes in kids' outcomes is that they began to interact much more with the people living in the surrounding neighborhood, who typically were from more affluent backgrounds. And when they have more of those interactions, that's the key driver that then leads to better outcomes for kids in the long run. Why is that? Maybe because you get job referrals, internship opportunities, and so on. But I think at a deeper level, maybe your aspirations change. If you've never met anybody who's gone to college or become a scientist or started a business, that's just not on your radar screen. If you now have those kinds of connections and interactions, it totally changes what you end up doing. And so, this again shows you that these pathways, I think, can be changed and are very important in driving economic mobility. I want to now turn to the third approach to increasing economic mobility, which is to focus on institutions of higher education. And here, once again, I want to start with some descriptive data that our team has put out and that Faye briefly mentioned, where similar to how we've constructed statistics on economic mobility for every neighborhood in America that I've been showing you, we've also constructed statistics on how every college in America contributes to economic mobility. Now, when you think about colleges' contributions to economic mobility, you really need to think about two dimensions. The vertical axis here is what we call the upward mobility rate. So what we're doing here is using data on 30 million students, linking information from the Department of Education to tax record data in order to be able to calculate on the vertical axis among the set of students who come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution, whose parents were in the bottom fifth of the income distribution, what fraction of those kids end up, when we follow them 10 years after college, reaching the top fifth of the income distribution. So kind of rags to riches, rising from the bottom to the top, the Horatio Alger version of the American dream. So if you look at the upper left side of this chart, you can see that, if you take my own institution, Harvard University, for example, it excels on that dimension. The vast majority of kids who come from low-income families who attend Harvard end up reaching the upper middle class or beyond. The same is true at Emory, the same is true at Georgia Tech. But if you think about a college's contribution to economic mobility, what matters is not just how the low-income kids on campus do after they attend that college, but how many low-income kids you have on campus to begin with. And that's what's shown on the horizontal axis. What fraction of the student body at these universities is coming from families in the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And unfortunately, when you look at that dimension, despite the many efforts these colleges have made to expand financial aid and so on, only 3 or 4% of kids at places like Harvard or Emory come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And so just mechanically, it is impossible that they're contributing a whole lot to economic mobility because there aren't that many kids from low-income families at those institutions. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you can see that there are a number of two-year institutions, places like Atlanta Technical College, Atlanta Metropolitan State College, that are serving many low-income students. But unfortunately, when you look at the outcomes at those colleges, they don't look that great at the moment. Not many of those kids, even after attending those institutions, are reaching the upper middle class. And so one way to see what the problem is in the higher education system in the United States in terms of creating economic mobility is that the upper right side of this chart is basically blank. You have very few places that both educate lots of low-income kids and give them pathways to the upper middle class. Now, that also suggests what the solution is. Either you have to figure out ways to move the dots that are in the upper left over to the right, so expand access to some of those elite private colleges, for example, that deliver great outcomes. But I think more importantly, and on a scalable level, we need to figure out how to improve outcomes at the colleges that are presently serving many, many low-income kids, help them graduate, help them get better jobs, have higher levels of income, and so on. Now, as in many cases, sometimes it's useful to be able to look at exceptions and try to learn from outliers. In this case, you might notice, there happens to be one dot up there in the upper right that, is way out there. What is that place? That is a small college in Queens, New York. If you've ever flown to LaGuardia Airport, it's right next to LaGuardia Airport, called the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology. It does exactly what you might think, given its name. It trains people in aeronautics and technology. Now, aeronautics and technology is a career that pays pretty well. It's going to put you in the upper middle class. It also is accessible to lots of kids from low and middle income backgrounds, apparently. And so essentially, the Vaughn College of Aeronautics and Technology, on a small scale, is helping many people rise up and achieve the American dream. Now, why do I highlight that example? It illustrates what I think is an important message more generally, which is that essentially, even in the modern day, there's sort of a modern day version of vocational training that can be quite valuable for creating economic mobility. And that's not just through particular institutions like this. There are programs that we see that you can bring in that exist in Atlanta and could be scaled up that deliver quite effective outcomes exactly along these lines. So let me give you an example of that. We have been spending a lot of time studying a program called Year Up, which was started in Boston and now is spread across the United States. It is a job training program that does three things. It teaches people a given set of skills, could be in financial operations, could be in information technology, a bunch of different fields. Then, critically, it gets people an internship at a firm looking to hire for exactly that set of skills. Could be like Bank of America or other tech firms. And then if all goes well, they end up getting a job at that firm. So I want to emphasize again that the way I look at this model is it again combines essentially a human capital intervention, teaching people a set of skills, with a social capital intervention, connecting you to an employer, giving you wraparound supports to get that job. There's a whole bunch of earlier job training programs in the United States on which we spent hundreds of millions of dollars that have been shown in randomized trials not to be effective, and they basically didn't do steps 2 and 3, they just did step 1. Now this program, they do all 3 of these steps, and why do I focus on this program? It happens to be one of the few programs that's been evaluated in a gold standard randomized trial. Here what we're doing is looking at a trial they ran in 2014 and linking data on those program participants to tax record data. And what we're doing here is just following the earnings over time of the people who participated in the program by chance, by the flip of a coin in the green, and people who didn't get access to the program in the orange. And what you could see is in 2014, when people were participating in the program, their earnings fell, which makes sense, right? They're getting job training rather than working, so they're earning less money. But then afterward, pretty much immediately afterward, their earnings go up by $9,000 per year, and they stay $9,000 higher on a permanent basis. This program ends up costing philanthropy about $10,000 or $12,000 a person. It has a payoff of $9,000 or $10,000 every single year afterward. Again, an enormously high social rate of return, showing that change is possible in this area as well. And so hopefully I've illustrated to you, not only can we study these questions, but we can actually make changes in each of these different domains that can measurably improve children's lives. In the last few minutes here, I want to talk about how we can take what we're learning about these effective programs and scale them. So if you take a program like Year Up, randomized trial run back in 2014, looks really effective, you might think, well, why aren't we doing that all over the United States on a really big scale? Year Up, despite that success, it grew somewhat, but it now trains about 4,500 people a year across America, which is a significant number. But relative to the scale of the United States, 4,500 people, that's not going to move the needle on that first graph that I showed you on the fading American dream. And so in the last part of this talk, I've been spending some time in recent years after doing this research thinking, in the past, my approach was, let's inform people, through philanthropy, through government, maybe there'll be change that will lead to impact. But I'm increasingly convinced that we need to do more to try to change incentives in order to create market forces that can allow people to invest more in effective programs. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about some new ideas that we are developing to try to do that, and then I'll conclude. To set the stage here, so if we're thinking about scaling effective programs to increasing economic mobility, I think there are 2 fundamental challenges that we need to address. The first is that while there are a handful of programs that I've just shown you where we have clear information on their effectiveness, for the vast majority of programs, we have very little information about how effective they are. So just in the case of job training that I was just focusing on, there are 5,000 different job training programs currently operating in America. There are like 10 of them that have been evaluated with randomized trials, like what I showed you for Year Up. But the vast majority, you might have some intuition about what works or what doesn't, but honestly, you don't have systematic evidence on which programs are effective and which programs are not. And so that makes it very difficult to scale up the most effective ones because you simply don't know which programs happen to be effective in your city. And so what I want to talk about is how, with modern data, and this could be relevant for many of you here in this audience, we can use methods that we've recently developed that we call a digital twin matching methodology to measure program impact, even without needing to run a randomized trial, which can be incredibly expensive and costly, as many of you know. So just to give you a quick sense of how that works, again, skipping the statistical technicalities, just what's the simple intuition here. Imagine you've got a set of people who participated in a program that you're running. It could be a job training program, an education program, any of the many programs you all are involved in. Suppose you were to send our team simply a list of who participated in that program. We do the following. We turn to the data our team is working with, which covers all Americans, 170 million American workers with information from anonymized census and tax data. And what we're going to do is for every person who participates in your program, we're going to find a set of people that we think of as digital twins, people who look identical to that person, but did not participate in your program. So in particular, if you look at the bottom of the slide, these are people who are of exactly the same age, same sex, same race, live in exactly the same place, and importantly, have exactly the same earnings in the previous 3 years as measured using precise tax record information. So we do that for person A, we do that for person B, and so forth and so on. And so using this set of digital twins, we now have essentially a synthetic control group where we didn't run a randomized trial, but we're going to compare the outcomes of the people who participated in your program to their digital twins. Now here is the key finding. It turns out that if you use this digital twins matching approach, the estimated program impacts you get are very closely aligned with what you get from gold standard randomized trials. So what we're doing here is for 13 different job training programs, we're plotting on the vertical axis the gold standard randomized trial estimate, which is very difficult to do. There's no way you'd be able to run a randomized trial for every single program. On the horizontal axis, we're constructing estimates using our digital twins matching methodology. And you can see the key point, which is that these two things are really well aligned. So in particular, there are some programs that generate a remarkable $20,000 a year increase in people's earnings, all the way over on the far right. You could have run a randomized trial to figure that out, or you could have just applied our algorithmic digital twins matching methodology and you would have gotten to the same conclusion. On the far left, unfortunately, there are programs that cost just as much, but generate zero impact on people's earnings. And again, you could have figured that out without running a trial. So this is incredibly useful for social science and for policy, because now you have a way to kind of get instantaneous information on what's working and what's not. And you can do that not just at one point in time, but you can do it year after year, see if your program's continuing to work. If it works in city A, does it work in city B? Does it work as we go to different neighborhoods and so on? So that you can see how that's really useful in solving the informational problem. So that's one issue I think we can address in the modern day. The second key issue, if you think about trying to scale programs that are very effective using market approaches, is that even if I tell you, okay, here's this Year Up program that's highly effective, you can rely on philanthropy or taxpayer dollars to try to scale that up, but there's only, some limit to that. There's only a certain amount of resources there. If you want to try to draw on the vast amounts of capital in the private market, there's no incentive for people to invest, right? So if I tell you, socially, Year Up is very valuable, or all these different programs I've been showing you, they generate huge social rates of return. What motivates you as a private individual to invest in another person's training when you don't get a share of those increased earnings? And so here we have a second key idea, which is that by giving investors a share of the increased earnings through the incremental tax revenues that are generated for the government, you can essentially create a market here. So the logic here is that the government, the federal government or the state government here in Georgia, has an equity stake in all of our earnings effectively. Every time you earn more money, you automatically pay more money to the federal government, pay more money to the state government. And so you can use that to essentially recycle the tax revenues back to investors and create a market that is potentially sustainable. And so let me just walk you through how that works and why we're excited about this possibility, and then I'll end. So here's the simple logic just shown in a flowchart. Imagine you've got a set of private investors who are just looking to make money. Let's say they don't care about social impact per se, just trying to earn a return like you would from investing in the stock of any company. We have set up a fund that we're calling Opportunity Capital, whose purpose it is to take those resources from private investors and allocate it to a set of service providers like Year Up or like other job training providers or other programs that promote economic mobility, where we determine what programs are effective using exactly the methods that I've been showing you. Those service providers say they train workers, they do whatever they do to help people do better. Workers earn more money, and now we get to the key steps of this model. As workers earn more money, they automatically pay more money to the federal government or the state government in the form of incremental tax revenues or reduced spending on transfers. And our idea is that if we can take that incremental tax revenue and channel it back to the fund and then repay the private investors, you've now created an asset where you say put up $10,000 to train someone, they end up earning $9,000 more every year. If you do the math, it turns out that they're going to pay about $1,500 a year extra in federal income taxes. You get that new tax revenue, an extra $1,500 a year that was only created because you invested back as a dividend payment year after year. So effectively, you've created an asset where you put up 10,000, you get a dividend payment of 1,500 every year, which creates an incentive for private investors to put money into effective programs. And we're hoping that that can really allow you to unlock programs here in Atlanta, throughout Georgia, that are effective in increasing economic mobility on scale. Now, the numbers here, I think, are quite substantial when you do the arithmetic. It really seems like this is viable. If we were to imagine $10 million of capital allocated upfront by private investors in the kinds of programs that I've been describing, it would increase people's earnings by about $200 million over the next 20 years. And importantly, private investors would get a rate of return simply from those incremental tax payments of about 12% back to them. So, that looks like an attractive rate of return that could genuinely draw private capital into these markets. And so, ultimately, this kind of approach or other related approaches to financing programs that are effective, I think the key thing here is that they can benefit everyone in the economy, from the workers that I just emphasized, to education and training providers who are always looking for more resources to scale effective programs, to businesses who end up having more productive workers that they can hire. There's always a concern about a shortage of talent, and you can address that in this way. Investors get a new source of returns. Taxpayers ultimately end up saving money because there's less spending on government transfers. And then, most importantly, I think the state economy and the city ends up benefiting through greater economic mobility and greater growth. And so to end on that note, I want to emphasize, throughout this talk, I've focused on economic mobility as a way to help people rise up and achieve better outcomes themselves. But I want to underscore that that also matters for all of us here in the broader Atlanta metro area and the US in general, where we see in other work that we've done that when you address these issues of economic opportunity, it's not just that you help people earn more, but you have other very important benefits for the economy. So in particular, we document using data from patents that there's an important phenomenon of lost Einsteins in the United States, where we estimate that if kids from lower income families, women, and kids from underrepresented minority backgrounds were to invent at the same rate as high income white men, you'd have 4 times as many inventors in America as you currently do. And not only would those kids be earning more themselves, but that would benefit all of us in the form of new drugs, new technologies, new businesses that would help everybody else in the economy. And so on that note, let me end by going back to the map that I started out with from the Opportunity Atlas here in Atlanta. I think when you look at this map, you can look at it in 2 different ways. One way to look at it is that the red-colored parts of this map are sort of the challenge or the problem that needs to be solved. But I would suggest that we instead look at it from a different perspective. Those red-colored neighborhoods are really the opportunity, the place that you can find those lost Einsteins, the place that you can make a difference. And it's a pleasure to be partnering with you all to make that difference going forward. Thank you so much.
How lucky are we to have Dr. Raj Chetty? And just so you know, he prefers that we call him Raj and not Dr. Chetty, so I don't want anyone to think I'm being disrespectful, but how lucky are we to have Raj and certainly to have his family join us. So I have the task, I should reintroduce myself. They acknowledged me in Casey for this event, but I'm Danny Shoy, proud Managing Director of Youth Development and Atlanta's West Side for the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. So just 3 quick housekeeping items and then 1 acknowledgement. And I want to say that I did not, this is the second time I've had the opportunity to share a stage with Raj. I did not pay him to say rise up. You kept hearing the rise up, and it's fitting that we're here at Mercedes-Benz Stadium. He's done that on his own. But speaking of rising up, I want to acknowledge one of my colleagues, and I'm going to ask him to stand, and he's going to be mad at me for doing this, but Jai Stokes, please stand up. Everyone look behind you. Jai Stokes, wave. So as Raj mentioned, rise up. Oh, Jice Murphy, sorry, Murphy. I have a fraternity brother whose name is Jai Stokes. I keep doing that. But Jice Murphy, thank you, Faye, joined the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation staff in 2023 as a Europe intern. And we were so impressed with him that we hired him. We said yes to him. He said yes to us. Every so often I torture Jice, we carpool together, and there are 30 years between us, and I make him listen to my music, and he hits me on his. So I just wanted to acknowledge Year Up since Raj acknowledged Year Up. Also, I don't know that we said, but a few people have been asking, the restrooms are to my left, to your right. Also, the slides will be made available. It's the number one question. I'm seeing a lot of nods, so we will share the slides. Last housekeeping note, and I'm looking out at a sea of red, and I know I'll get in trouble if I don't do this. I know today is the founding anniversary for the women of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. There are a lot of them here, Deltas. I don't want to get in trouble, including one of our speakers. So with those said, I want to introduce our next speaker, and I'm going to do something a little unconventional in the interest of time, and she may be upset with me after I do this, but her name is Sherry Chisholm, and there is no second E in Sherry's name. So if I were describing Sherry, and I did an acronym for each letter of her name, I'd say she's smart, because she is wicked smart, and beyond all the degrees that she has. She's humble, and I'm seeing that in my interaction with her. I know that equity, E, matters for her. She's responsive. So when I first met Sherry, I thought maybe that it was AI on her phone, but Sherry is fast on a response, and they're smart responses. So she's responsive, She's responsible. I know she does not take lightly the work that she's leading in Charlotte as the executive director of Leading on Opportunity, and I know that inclusion matters to her. So I'm going to invite Sherry up to the stage at this point to talk with us for a little bit, and then I'm going to moderate a discussion with Sherry and Raj.
Thank you, Danny.
You're welcome.
Okay, can you all hear me okay? Yes. Good afternoon. It is really good to be with you all today. I spent the good part of a decade in Atlanta in my 20s, so coming back to Atlanta always feels like coming home, so thank you so much for having me. I know that you all are interested in hearing about our journey in Charlotte, but I'm going to do this in 3 parts. Are we on the right slide? Yes, I'm going to do this in 3 parts. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me and my family's journey with economic mobility. I'll tell you a lot about Charlotte, and then we'll talk about Atlanta together. So I can't talk about me and not talk about where I'm from. I live in Charlotte, I lived in Atlanta, but I am born and raised in Detroit. And so we have a Detroiter in the room. What up, though? It is so good to see you. So what I joke and say is if you've never been to Detroit, it is effectively Alabama with snow. And I say that because for many people, and including my family, we migrated as a part of the Great Migration to Detroit. So if you are a millennial like myself and a Black woman, what is often true is that if your parents are not from Detroit, certainly your grandparents are not from Detroit. And that's the case for me. On my mother's side, my grandmother, Ruby, and my grandfather, Luther, came to Detroit in the 1950s as a part of the big industrial boom. They were looking first to escape the Jim Crow South in northern Alabama, and they were looking second to achieve the middle class dream. They wanted some place where they could own a home, where they could send their kids to school, where they could earn a livable wage. And in large part, that really worked out. My grandfather worked on the line at Ford. My grandmother was a teacher's aide. The next generation, my father started on the line and worked his way up to a crane operator at a coal company that provided coal for Ford Motor Company. My mother was an elementary school principal, retired as an elementary school principal, and after leaving corporate America, I spent a good chunk of my career leading in large urban school districts, one of them right here in Fulton County. So generation after generation, because of the great risk that my family took 3 generations ago, I am before you today as someone who's been able to have a really great career, who's been able to go to some of the top universities, and yet we know these issues still persist. As much as the great risk that my parents and grandparents took for me led to great opportunity, there's no secret that Detroit was also hit really hard by continued poverty, crime, and drug abuse. And in particular, drug abuse hit my family quite acutely. So when my husband and I got married, we knew that we wanted to take those same aspirations as Luther and Ruby and find where we would start our dream, where we'd plant our family and continue that legacy for our daughter, Jocelyn. And so that is what brings us to Charlotte. I moved to Charlotte in hopes of economic mobility for my family. So I've told you about me. Let me tell you about what was happening in Charlotte just before we came. So in 2014, Charlotte is known as a bright spot in the South. It, at the time, was booming with millennials coming in droves. There was more hot yoga and more craft breweries than we know what to do with, right? That was the thing at the time. There were cranes in the sky, there were people moving to work for the banking industry, and yet Raj releases a study. And this 2014 study ranks us dead last in terms of economic mobility. And for many folks who'd had the opportunity to access the great things in Charlotte, this was a shock to the system. We often talk about it as a punch in the gut. How could this be true that all of these great things are happening in Charlotte, and yet folks who are from here don't have access to those opportunities? For many of us in the room who've either been funding the work, doing the programming in the work, or have relatives or ourselves been in the work, we know that this is something that's been existing for a long time, and so many of us are just excited that we're acknowledging that it's so. No matter where you stood on the spectrum, Charlotte responded as Charlotte does, with bold urgency and action, wanting to right the wrongs that we now know are true in Charlotte. And so the study comes out in 2014, and like any good community, when there's something wrong and you want to respond, what do you think we did? Any guesses? We put together a task force, right? You put together a task force, you put together a committee, we're going to come together and figure out what's wrong. And the truth of the matter is, we swirled in that task force for a while. We had faith-based leaders, government leaders, private sector folks, philanthropists, nonprofit leaders all around the table, and yet not much was happening. By 2015, we have a group of folks who've come together. They've released a task force report, which has nearly 100 recommendations for what we will do over the course of a generation to improve outcomes. We have our report, right? Our task force and our report, but no action has been taken. And then in 2016, something really unfortunate happens that is unlike Charlotte, which is very brand conscious. We have a police-involved shooting of a Black man. And resulting from that, protests start. And we're now again faced with the reality of the economic inequities in our community, and we're held to the fire for what we're going to do. So this is the point where we eventually move from thinking about the problem to now acting on it. So in 2017, two foundational things happened. The report was written, and that's out and published for everyone to access. What was new at the time, and I think still continues to be, is that Charlotte stood up a standalone entity known as Leading on Opportunity. That's the organization that I get to lead. Leading on Opportunity is focused on maintaining our city and county's commitment to this work. We knew at the time that economic mobility was so important to us that it couldn't be someone's side hustle, right? The direct service providers are already doing that great work every day. The funders are committed to funding the work. They need someone who could hold the truth and make sure that we're tracking in the right direction together. So Leading on Opportunity is formed in 2017, and in 2020, I come in as the second executive director. And what I hear from across the community is there's no shortage of commitment to the work, but a real lack of understanding of what it takes to get there, how long it's going to take, and how we do that work together. So I decided to transition the organization from one that was kind of loosely funding-based and loosely direct service-based to one that has a systems orientation. And I bring with me my experience as a corporate consultant, so you will hear some of that in how our strategy is shaped. So we focus on data, strategy, and policy, and situate ourselves as a community consultant around that work. So that means we don't provide direct service, nor do we give out major grants. But we provide data, policy, and strategy supports to nonprofits who do the work of economic mobility, and we provide that same knowledge to funders who fund the work. The idea being is we want the direct service providers to continue to do that work well, but we want to be the connective tissue between those who want to fund it and those who do it every day. And the hope is that we create alignment and reduce the complexity in a really complex and entrenched issue. And so I told you that we started with data, policy, and strategy. It also took us a while to get to the place where we would focus on that. I think in work like this, it often is the common tendency to go to the direct service work, which we absolutely need. But there are a lot of great folks who are doing that. What we saw happening in Charlotte is that the folks who had the ability to have the most influence were in the room, but weren't moving towards outcomes together. So our work, which is also really important to lift up, is that we focus on those folks who lead these organizations. So the counterparts, so the folks who sit around my board, are those who lead our county. We have a county manager and city manager system. So our county manager, our city manager, our school superintendent, some of the foremost CEOs, as well as, which makes us quite unique, we have those who represent the grassroots community. So we have neighborhood association presidents, we have those who lead in the specific determinants of economic mobility to inform our strategy. And the idea being is that we are community-based, we are community-informed, but we want those who pull the highest levers to be listening and acting on our recommendations. So with those people in place, we started with data. And it was particularly important in a finance and banking town where folks were calling for me to provide updates on economic mobility. Another word for economic mobility is poverty alleviation. Like, Sherry, quarter over quarter, what's happening in poverty? I'm like, nothing. Same thing that was happening the quarter before. But they wanted to understand how we move things together and how we base our work in data. So we started by defining an opportunity compass, which tells us every 2 to 3 years if we're moving in the right direction. It tells us what our issues are and where we need to move forward together. It is not solely a tool of accountability, but we hope that it is a tool of civic imagination. So we started with data, which tells us where our issues are and where we can do better. The second area we leaned into was strategy. So as I said before, Charlotte has no issue getting in the room together. We have a real difficult time driving towards actions together. So that's when I got back to kind of my consulting roots. If we can get the mayor in the same room with the superintendent, with the president of Bank of America, that's more than half the battle. How are we facilitating that time together to drive towards outcomes? So my team comes in and steps in and plays that role, similar to a strategic advisor in your organization or a consultant you may have hired to do that work for them. And then the third, and which I will always consider the most important, is policy. And we wrestled with this a lot. I think a lot of folks thought that if we worked on policy, we'd be showing up to city county meetings and like matching shirts with duct tape on our mouth. That is not what we wanted to do, but we wanted to see ourselves as policy educators and influencers. So we spend our days figuring out how do the policies that impact economic mobility connect together. So for example, how does childcare, which is often seen as a women's issue, or at best a family issue, impact workforce? And make sure we're bringing in those corporate leaders so that they can advocate at the state level or make changes at the local level for us. And so in a lot of ways, we've seen really great success. For example, in early care and education, as Raj lifted up, we instituted universal pre-K across Mecklenburg County. That's the county in which Charlotte sits, such that anyone who lives in Mecklenburg County has access to free, high-quality pre-K. That means you're setting that child up for academic success, but also providing a safe and affordable place for that employee to send their child so that they can get to work. Pre-K is both a workforce and an education challenge. The second thing we did is we've also brought together college access nonprofits. So they're a collection of 9 college access nonprofits serving somewhere between 50 to 200 students who say, we know we're doing something really great, but we need to work together so that we can have the ear of the school board, the ear of the superintendent, the ear of the higher education institutions. We, again, with that strategy support, help them define what we call the Crescent Coalition. It's a collaborative of college access nonprofits that decided they wanted to collaborate on things that make sense to them, as opposed to it being dictated based on funding dollars when it may not actually make sense. So we provide that support. There are a couple other areas in housing where we have a $100 million trust fund, housing trust fund for that work. And then most recently, I think it's important to list that Charlotte is beginning to plan for the future. So last year, in the last election, we passed a transportation referendum, or a 1-cent sales tax, that is expected to generate about $19.5 billion over the course of 30 years to improve our roads, rails, and buses. This is an investment we're making now for the future. Some of the data that Raj has helped us understand is that when folks live closer to their place of employment, they tend to earn more. When children have more than one way of getting to school, they're likely to show up. And so we believe that our investment in transit is also an economic mobility advancement. So we've had a lot of success, right? I told you that we stood up leading on opportunity. We have the great results in 2024. Raj comes out with a second study that ranks us 38 out of 50, third most improving community across the country, the only one where white economic Thank you. The only one where white economic mobility remained the same as black economic mobility increased, thereby eradicating the zero-sum game that people like to lift up or believe is true about this work. So lots of really great things to be proud of. And in 2022, just 2 years before, my husband and I have been in Charlotte by this time about 2 years. And I told you about the great strides that my family had made for me. We had decided to move to Charlotte. We've been there about 2 years. I have my daughter, who's now 5 years old, and we're ready to buy a home, right? If y'all remember what was happening towards maybe the middle end of 2021, 2022, I think we were still in the pandemic, right? Like that was still very much so happening. The housing market was crazy. We were looking for a home, and we were given 15 minutes to do a tour. Folks were putting in over asking price. It was a ridiculous time. And so after putting in offer after decline offer, my very lovely realtor, who was considered one of the best because I have this very fancy job in Charlotte, so I get access to the best, she looks at me and she said, Sherry, and my husband Joe, is there someone that you could borrow $50,000 or $60,000 from to contribute to your down payment? And I said, no, ma'am. Not with a dad who worked third shift and a mother who was a public school educator. And I lift that up because we have made great strides in one generation, but the work of economic mobility takes a very, very long time. It requires us to be committed to it for generation after generation after generation. And my hope is that for my 4-year-old daughter, we will be able to send her to school and her not need to take out student loans, that we will be able to give her a down payment on a house, but that is 4 generations after Ruby and Luther. And so it requires us to continue to be committed to it. And in Charlotte, we're committed to that work, so much so that we're asking others to join us on the journey. So that brings me now to Atlanta. What are y'all gonna do? Given this opportunity, given your awareness of the Chetty study, it provides a great opportunity to use this moment to make tremendous change. And as I said, I spent a good portion of my 20s and 30s in Atlanta, and I know who Atlanta is. I know that everyone knows that it is in a lot of ways considered to be the center or the birthplace of civil rights, which really was not that long ago. But even more recently, when we look to the work of Maynard Jackson and his work with the airport and 25% of contracts going to minority business owners, first of all, I don't know if you all know that usually it's around 10%, so 25% was tremendous. And the work that happened back then has set folks up for us to call Atlanta the Black Mecca, for us to have a thriving Black middle class, for folks to continue to contribute and grow here. And even more recently than that, I was working at Fulton County Schools in the 2010s, and I remember the film industry was coming here quickly, and the state was making some changes, and the city was aligning and permitting. And what that meant is that folks who were interested in the work, who were makeup artists or worked in the film industry in other capacities, could live and work right where they were and not be pulled away, contributing to the economy, but also staying with their families and not having to make that hard choice. I remember the school district at the time, the Career and Technical Education Department at Fulton County, was realigning itself so that we could prepare students who wanted to graduate and go straight to work to have the skills to do that, building relationships with those employers. I lift these up because these are examples of strong public-private partnerships, but also work towards economic mobility that y'all have done before. And so that then tells me that it's possible again. So there were some negative things that led to the work we did in Charlotte, but there's some really positive things happening here shortly. I know the FIFA World Cup is coming, Super Bowl 62, I believe, will be here. There's lots of great attention coming. How do you use that or this moment as an opportunity to galvanize action for everyone, so that when we look back on this moment, we knew it was a defining time where we laid the path and the groundwork for everyone to succeed. Thank you so much. I'm gonna leave this here.
So let's give another round of applause to Sherry. And I just want to quickly acknowledge, since I did a non-conventional introduction, I want to acknowledge Sarah Oppenheimer from Opportunity Insights. Sarah, just stand for a second, please. Let's give Sarah a round of applause. She's a member of Raj's team, and I wanted to acknowledge that because as you've asked about the slides and what other resources you can take, there are resources in the room. And Sarah particularly said to us when we were thinking about this, don't focus specifically on what Charlotte did. It matters, the context matters, but think about how they use the data, because Charlotte and Atlanta are both great cities, but they're different. So I want to thank you for that, Sarah, and just acknowledge you. So thank you both, Raj and Sherry, for your insights and for making the time. And I know, looking out at the crowd, knowing most of these amazingly smart, wickedly smart people, like both of you, that there are questions bubbling, but I want to start us off just with a few questions of my own. And I actually, we've been looking forward to this for like 7 months now, so I had a ton of questions, but I'm going to limit it to just a few questions. So I actually want, Raj, for you to take the first one. So when you think of a city like Atlanta with rapid gentrification, what investments best prevent displacement while still improving neighborhood conditions? And you have a mic in your, have on your lav still.
Can you all hear me, or no? Is it not on?
It's not on. We may want you to use, is there a mic in your?
Okay, can you hear me now? Oh, sure. So, yeah, great. So gentrification, definitely a key, issue in Atlanta as in many other cities. I think, the way people often think about gentrification, Danny, is sort of, we need to prevent it from happening, or it's strictly a negative. But you might have been able to see from some of the data that I'm showing that there are ways in which gentrification can actually bring opportunity if done right in some sense, rather than just displacing low-income people and having them move somewhere else. If you can find a way, as you're suggesting, to have place gentrify, higher-income people move in, but you retain some lower-income folks in those places, that exactly creates the kind of mixed-income community. It's kind of the reverse of the way, or along the lines of the Hope 6 evidence that I showed you. Creating these mixed income communities really seems to improve prospects for economic mobility going forward. So how can you do that concretely? I think two approaches. One, I think the most important overarching thing is to be deliberate and think about this rather than just view gentrification as an inevitable thing that you either have to stop or live with. One is to be explicit about building affordable housing in neighborhoods that gentrify. That's basically what the Hope 6 approach was, retaining some public housing, subsidized housing through programs like LIHTC or housing vouchers, other ways of giving people a foothold who may not have the same incomes in neighborhoods that are gentrifying. But I think it's also useful to think about other complementary strategies. So if you think about, say, the evidence I was showing toward the end on job training programs that seem to quickly lift people's incomes, if you make it more feasible for people to stay in their neighborhoods by giving them access to those kinds of programs that will help their own incomes go up, and they will be able to afford the higher rents as they rise, that's another way to avoid, just pure displacement as neighborhoods gentrify. So I think the main message I would give is view gentrification as perhaps a path to creating mixed income areas and be deliberate in creating that mixing, both through housing policy and other complementary policies.
My next question for you, for Sherry, and you talked a little bit about this, but how much did timing and current events play in leading an opportunity's ability to coalesce around economic mobility in the wake of the release of Raj's study? And why do you think Raj's study resonated so strongly with Charlotte at that moment?
I think first, Charlotte has always been a place that has done things together. So in Charlotte, and I'll use this is common language, which may feel a bit weird, but in Charlotte we often talk about the work of the 5 white men that happened in Charlotte during the 80s, and it was led by Hugh McCall, the president of Duke Energy, the president of Wells Fargo, which was First Union at the time, the mayor, and one other person that I always forget, but he was also a white man. And that group would get around a table and make decisions on behalf of Charlotte to say, how are we going to bring the symphony here? Or what business do we want to be here? Or where do we want parks to be? And that was an example of a public-private partnership, right? They certainly could have done some things differently, but they were working together to make decisions on behalf of Charlotte. And so when Raj's study came out, I think that it hit us it hit us directly because we were always a community that had been working really hard to do things together on behalf of Charlotteans. We wanted things to be better. And we're also pretty brand conscious. I don't know if you've ever been to Charlotte, but it's beautiful. It's very clean, it's very pretty. And so when we heard that information from Raj, it felt really hard to be true. But because of the work that we did before, it wasn't hard for us to get to action. And by action, I mean bring the people together. And so Raj's work really just kind of lit a fire under us to go back to what we always knew to be true, that we all need to get together to figure out how we're going to move in the right direction together. And now that table of 5 white men is bigger, it's more colorful. There's 1 or 2 women who are on it, but it's still us working together in that same way to make change for Charlotte.
And Sherry, I so appreciate you bringing race into the conversation because looking at your site, I know the work that you've done to study the impact of segregation and also to build social capital, so thank you for that. My next question for you, Raj, is data and community are often seen as opposite ends of the spectrum. How has Charlotte effectively brought those 2 poles together?
So I would say what I've been really encouraged by in Charlotte, thanks in part to the work of Sherry and many others, is to embrace the fact that there is a challenge and not deny, the data. And then really try to, one of the key challenges in economic mobility, which Sherry mentioned, is it's really a long game. You can't see change within 1 or 2 years. So how do you create earlier indicators to kind of know that you're on the right path? And how do you try to encourage people? Yes, it will take 20 years, 30 years to really see fundamental changes. But you can tell by looking at markers along the way, like test scores or how many kids are attending school or high school graduation rates or a variety of other indicators that we are kind of headed in the right direction. I think that's the way you bring these things together to help, encourage people in their own communities that you can make progress, but also keep your eye on that North Star long-term vision.
Perfect. Thank you, Raj. And y'all just bear with me. I know you have questions. I'm going to get there. So Sherry, question for you. Charlotte is rapidly changing and becoming more diverse and expected to grow from 3 million to 4.6 million in the next 25 years. How will Charlotte maintain the momentum?
I think it's hard, to be honest, to maintain momentum over the long haul. This kind of answers the previous question to Raj, but I think it's really important to be pragmatic in the work too. Like when we talk about what it looks like to continue the work of economic mobility or an initiative in a particular community, I think about it a lot like managing a campaign. So what do we need now for the work? And early on, we needed data. We needed our own local data that would measure or keep us accountable, measure our success, and help us to inspire. What we need now is to be able to apply that data. So the team at Lead In on Opportunity, our data team has shifted quite a bit to be those who can sit with community members, those who lead nonprofits to help them analyze their data, shift their programming, solicit funds in the way that makes sense for them. And I think that that's something that we have accepted in Charlotte, is that the work will continue to evolve in terms of maybe even name or exactly what we're doing, but the core of it will remain the same. And I think that that'll continue to be true as long as we keep our center around public-private partnerships.
Thank you, Sherry. Raj, because of the gift, i.e. not 1 study, but 2, that your data, the evidence is given to us, and Sherry, knowing that you're just a little ways up the highway that we can always call and learn from Charlotte, I'm going to nix all the rest of my questions and ask you both a final question, and then we're going to open the floor for Q&A. So my final question to both of you is I want to ask you, what are your top 3 recommendations for cities considering taking on economic mobility work?
So I would say, coming back to some of the themes we've talked about, first, connect people to opportunity. So I say that because I think we found in many different contexts that social capital and who you're connected to is crucial. And so in whatever domain you're working in housing policy, in job training, in the workforce space, in education, in many different contexts, even though the focus is per se not on social capital, we see that both providing financial resources and educational resources in tandem with those connections and social support to use those resources effectively has dramatically more impact than trying to do things just one at a time. And so I think that's one key takeaway. A second, I think, is we live in the age of data and of measurement, of AI and so on. And I think we should harness those tools to really understand whether the investments we're making are working. So in the business sector, it would be completely standard to say, I developed this new product, I made this new investment, I want to know what the return was on that. I think for far too long in the public sector and the nonprofit space, we haven't had that kind of information. And some of the tools that I was talking about at the end, like the digital twins method, the modern data we have, can, I think, really unlock that. And I would encourage folks to contact our team or think about other ways to measure the impacts of the programs you're working on. And then finally, I think, Danny, we should think about new financial mechanisms to fund things that are effective, coming to the very last point that I made. So again, often traditionally we've relied on philanthropy, relied on the public sector, which obviously plays an enormous role. But at the end of the day, I think you've got to recognize that incentives matter and people are going to do things that benefit them. And so creating the right structure of incentives so that we get people to invest in other people, helping others rise up, to use your word, is really what we should try to create going forward.
I promise I did not plant the rise up, but we love it. Every time you say it, Raj, we smile. Sherry, what are your 3 recommendations?
I think from someone who has been a practitioner on the ground, what's really important is getting to know your community. So the work that we've done in Charlotte, we're really proud of. We think that there are some things that are transferable, but what makes Atlanta tick, right? Like what gets folks up every day, what agitates them is really important when thinking about how to do this work well. I think the second is like buckling up and realizing that this is long-term work, and so be committed to it for a while. There certainly need to be those opportunities where you lift up the milestones of success, but be in it for a while. And I'm proud to say that Charlotte, we've proven that change is possible. So maintain that hope that good things can happen.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Raj. Just give them another round of applause. So, as I open the floor for questions, I'm just going to say 3 things, and I'm going to say them very respectfully. A question has a question mark at the end, so we have a limited time, so please do ask your question. 2, to go back to Faye's frame, know that we have, after this, a panel of our Atlanta leaders who are driving the work. So if you have an Atlanta question, I'd ask you to hold it, unless it's really one that you want to gain insight from, either from Raj, given his work, or from Sherry, given her work in Charlotte. But otherwise, I'm going to ask you to hold those questions for that. Hold that for that panel. And then last, I will tell you that I mentioned resources in the room, the slides, certainly human resources in the room, but I'd also want to let you know that we are recording this session that we will have for future use. So just want to share that, because we probably should have said that at the outset, that this is being recorded so that we can continue to learn from this long after we don't have our speakers with us. So with that, I'm going to open the floor, and there are mics on both sides. Jice Murphy, thank you for the grace, has 1 mic, and there's also another on the other side of the floor. So just please come up to the mic. Any questions? People are moving. And if you will just introduce yourself, we don't need title, but just in the interest of time, just introduce yourself and your organization. And I will field the question to either Sherry or to Raj.
Okay, me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Nancy Flake Johnson, Urban League of Greater Atlanta. This question is for Raj. Is your data available disaggregated by race?
Yes, so thank you for raising that. So if you go to the Opportunity Atlas website, you can look at the data by race, so you can click white, black, Hispanic, Asian, and look at black kids growing up in a particular neighborhood in Atlanta, white kids growing up in a particular neighborhood in Atlanta, what do their outcomes look like? And I'm glad you raised that, because race is a key driver, as you know, of economic opportunity. If you take a black child and a white child growing up in a family at the same income level, you see dramatically higher rates of upward mobility for white children than for black children. And in particular, it actually turns out to be important to break down the data not just by race, but by sex as well.
Yes.
So there's an enormous difference in rates of upward mobility for black boys relative to white boys. But for black girls relative to white girls, they actually have very similar rates of economic mobility. And so you can look at all of that data on that same website. Even in the present day, there are enormous racial divides, and that is clearly needs to be part of the conversation.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Next, we're going to come to you, Brittany.
Hello, my name's... Hi, I'm Brittany Collins with the Fitzgerald Foundation. And Sherry, this question is for you. As the leaders in Charlotte sat down to address economic mobility, I'm making an assumption, but help us understand why you didn't start with issue areas and you kept this task force broad. because often you may see economic mobility, we start with education or we start with healthcare and we start in really silos. But help us understand why you all made that intentional decision.
Oh, well, I would love to say that it was intentional. We fell into it, to be honest. So we started with determinants of economic mobility. So our task force report is organized around college and career readiness, early care and education, child and family stability. So those are all safety net things. Do you have a house? Can you get to work? And then the cross-cutting factors of the impact of segregation and social capital. And so that's kind of how we organize the work around economic mobility. And there was a real pull for folks for leading on opportunity to pick one particular issue area. And for the first couple of years, they did that almost whack-a-mole style. And so after failed attempts at doing the work, when I came in as the second executive director, they were looking for something different. So we learned through it, to be quite honest, and I try to be honest with folks, that we, as one of my board members says often, we stubbed our toe a lot. We tried a couple things before we got to the place where we knew that there was something that worked well. And it was particularly important that we get out of the particular issue area, because that's what we've done before. Like, we're going to fix this, then we're going to fix that, and then that issue pops back up. But it helped us look at the work as a collective. It's hard to maintain a collective focus, but that's how we got there.
All right, so I'm going to ping pong left and right, and I will say I'm glad we have a lot of questions. I'm going to take the last question from John Amen. When we get to the last question, Raymond, I see you. So next question, left mic.
Thank you. Raymond Pierce with the Southern Education Foundation, and my question is for Raj. Raj, I'm going to take you back to your slide when you talked about policy recommendations, and a lot of us who are in this field, we're looking for answers, we're looking for solutions. So one of your policy recommendations highlighted vouchers. And so my question is, are you familiar with many of the criticisms and oppositions to vouchers, and can you respond to that? Because I thought your presentation was a little one-sided on that. So can you, what do you know about those criticisms, and what credibility and merit would you give those criticisms?
Yeah. So, when we discuss vouchers, a number of issues that people bring up, and you should tell me if this is hitting on the things you're thinking about, are that first, you're perhaps destabilizing communities. So people are leaving communities where they were living, and now you help a few folks who move to higher opportunity places, but what about the place you left behind? So the way I think about that concern is, if you take, for example, the Seattle analysis we did, the vast majority of those families were going to move anyway. As you may know, rates of mobility, geographic mobility, rates of turnover in lower income populations are extremely high. So the vast majority of those families were going to leave where they were living regardless. And the way I think about what we were doing with the additional support we were providing is basically helping those families move to a higher opportunity area, conditional on moving anyway. Now, that said, I think the concern that vouchers by themselves leave many people behind, and there are many communities that need to be revitalized, I think that's absolutely right. And so that's why I emphasize the second approach of place-based investment. Things like Hope 6, we'll hear about purpose-built communities, other approaches that really try to bring opportunity to people where they currently live, rather than move people to opportunity. I think it makes a lot of sense to focus on that. But I don't think you have to make kind of an either-or choice, that you only do one or the other. I think you can do place-based investment, and at the same time that families are trying to make choices to move to different places, you can support them in moving to higher opportunity areas with better schools and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to come to my right, Mike. Sade.
Yes, my name is Sade Jones, and I'm a resident of English Avenue, Vine City area. And my upbringing was similar to Sherry's as far as parents migrating from the south to the north. But Raj, as you were talking about Hope 6 and the displacement of those families that were in concentrated areas, did you consider in your raising it so high that the impact that it had on all the inner city Black neighborhoods that were displaced, and the cultural and historical relevance that they were losing when they were displaced in that way, and the political stronghold and relevance in Atlanta that was displaced also? Did you consider that in your assessment?
Yeah, so thank you for surfacing that. So you're absolutely right that the displacement costs of Hope 6 are large, and what we are focused on in this study and the analysis I showed you was simply the benefits for the children who ended up living in those neighborhoods in public housing after we created the mixed income development versus before. What we do not account for in the chart that I showed you is that there was a significant cost potentially to the families who were living there to begin with, and it ended up being forced to move to different places. Now, there's prior analysis that's been done of that focuses on the economic consequences, and they showed that actually if you look at the kids of the families that were displaced, a number of them start to do better as well because they ended up moving to certain higher opportunity areas. But what that analysis does not capture, and that your question highlights, is there's a lot else that's been destroyed of community and culture and pride in those areas, and absolutely acknowledge that. And so what I take from Hope 6 is not necessarily that we should take exactly that approach going forward, but rather if we can come up with ways to think about the same mechanisms that revitalize communities, connect people to opportunity and so on, without having as high of a displacement cost, that would be the best of both worlds. But I think you're absolutely right to emphasize those costs in the context of Hope 6.
Thank you. And just quick acknowledgement, Sade is not only a West Side resident, but our former NPU leader of English Avenue of Vine City. Thank you for your leadership, Sade. Last question I said that we would take from John, so I'm going to take the last question over here from John Amman.
Yeah, no, thank you, John. I live in Vine City and lead the West Side Future Fund. Now, we really wanted to zero in on your comment, gentrification done right. So it seems from the data, proximity to higher income really, really matters. And it seems, what is the right ratio of that, and thinking at a neighborhood level, back to absolutely keep, policies in place for, displacement not to occur. As you think about a neighborhood build out, as you would think about a housing build out, what's the right mix? And does your data tell you X% of the neighborhood should be market rate, Y% of the neighborhood should be this? Have you done any kind of analysis to say, if that gentrification is done right, what does it look like? Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's exactly the kind of next question I would say in this line of research, to try to, ideally what you'd like to see is kind of a curve of if you have a different mix of households, at what's the optimal point at which you get the best outcomes. I don't think we know the answer to that yet. What I can say is the kind of mix that was achieved in Hope 6, and others will have more familiarity in the local context, but nationally, it ends up being something like 50% are public housing, 50% are either market rate or other affordable housing through LIHTC and other sources. That combination appears to have delivered, as you saw, better outcomes. Now, is 50% the right number, or should it have been 60? Would we have done even better, or 40? That I don't think we know yet, but I think it's exactly the kind of question we should be investigating further.
Good. Join me one last time in giving a round of applause to thank Sherry and Raj both. And I just want to, before you exit, just thank you for your candor, for your insights, for your commitment to this work and on this issue. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. All right, so at this time, and I know that we're running a little bit behind given the parking issue, but we still want to respect your time. I'm just actually going to ask our next four speakers, and I'll introduce you after you come up, Carol Naughton, Kathy Waller, Courtney English, and Othello Meadows, just to come up and take any seats that you will. And because I know you all so well, you can sit in whatever seats you want. So I don't want you to feel like you're being shorted on the time. The best news is, again, we can access Sherry and Raj after. And with the exception of Othello, who used to live here, and I'll introduce him first, our other three leaders are all local. So they're not very far away, so you can have more time with them beyond today. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Othello Meadows. Othello is the managing director of Portfolio. He leads Blue Meridian Partners place-based work. Othello is based out of Omaha, and he's the immediate past CEO of 75 North, which is a member of the Purpose-Built Communities Network. Next to him, we have Courtney English, who I think you all know is the chief of staff to the mayor for the city of Atlanta. Courtney is Atlanta born, Atlanta bred, and when he dies, he will be Atlanta dead, right?
Straight.
Is that expression? Fully educated in Atlanta, and Courtney made history not that long ago by being the youngest ever chair of the Atlanta Board of Education. So thank you, Courtney, for being with us. Carol Naughton is president and CEO of Purpose-Built Communities. a CEO of Purpose-Built Communities. Carol has had so many hats in this work and in this space, from executive director of Eastlake Foundation, and also was an attorney with the Atlanta Housing Authority when the work in Eastlake started. Carol, glad that you're here. And I'm intentionally not sharing all the many degrees that they have, because I know that all of you can go to the internet and get full bios. And last, but certainly not least, one of our women of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Kathy Waller. Kathy serves as the executive director of ACP, the Atlanta Committee for Progress. Kathy has many skills, many titles. Many of you know her as the former CFO at the Coca-Cola Company. So with that said, I'm going to jump right in. And my first question, Othello, is for you. Oftentimes, we use an acronym to talk about your organization. We say BMP, Blue Meridian Partners. Just start off by telling everybody a little bit about who Blue Meridian Partners is and about the model and the way that you work with your place-based work.
Sure. First of all, it's great to be here. So many familiar faces. This feels like a second home, so glad to be back. BMP, or Blue Meridian Partners, is a funds aggregator. And what that means is we get out and we raise dollars to invest in things that we think have an opportunity to be catalytic and address this issue that we're talking about today at scale. Scale is our favorite word, right? It is the thing that gets us all up out of bed every day. And so trying to find things that we can put catalytic dollars behind in hopes of also getting other dollars off the sideline and incentivizing the public sector, right, to make similar investments is really all we're about, is trying to make sure that this work that gets done and is often underfunded and is often on this hamster wheel of saying, like, how are we going to do this work 2 years from now? We try to be, we try to step in that gap and say, we're with you for the long term on these really entrenched, difficult problems that we're all working on. So for us, we have to make the case that the places we want to invest in have a high likelihood of success and are evidence-backed. And we have to get our investors as excited as we are about the places that we choose to invest in.
Thank you. One of those places you've chosen to invest in, and I'll give a little bit of context when we come back around, fuller context, is Atlanta. So next I want to turn to Courtney, to Mr. English. And Courtney, have you talk a little bit more about what the NRI, the Neighborhood Reinvestment Initiative, is that you are leading for the city of Atlanta?
Yeah, so thanks, Danny, and thank all of you for being here and bearing with us. We threw a lot at you, and y'all are incredibly attentive, which demonstrates your passion, your love for this work, but most importantly, your love for the city of Atlanta. The Neighborhood Reinvestment Initiative is an initiative that is designed to reinvest. We're really bad at naming things, by the way, so we call it exactly what it is. It's an initiative to reinvest in some of our most underserved communities, communities that were redlined, communities that suffer displacement pressures, communities that candidly have been forgotten in some cases, but also have good, strong bones. They have rich history. They have strong, incredible neighborhood leadership. Communities that, with the right push, with the right partnership, they will produce extraordinary results and extraordinary people that will go on to lead the city of Atlanta. Folks like Kathy Waller, for example. And so we've targeted 7 specific areas in which we're going to do a deep dive on because of Dr. Chetty or Raj's research. We know very much that Atlanta is a tale of two cities. Opportunities concentrated in one half of the city, and we're trying to change that. And so NRI is a very robust, ambitious effort to reinvest upwards of $5 billion into the most underserved areas in the city, doing it in conjunction with community, with many of the folks already in this room. And so we look forward to continue to working with you and bothering you and answering, asking all of the tough questions with you.
And Courtney, just looking out into the audience, and again, knowing some of the best resources sit with us right in front of us, are hidden in plain sight, can you just quickly list the neighborhoods involved?
Yeah, so
and as you do that, there are folks in the room that are working on the ground with those community-based organizations. I'd just love for them to stand.
Yeah,
I know there was a quiz, did you?
Yeah, he's gonna get me in trouble.
Do you want me to help?
All right, so let's say this. So we talk about the neighborhoods. There are actually a number of neighborhoods that we think about them in geographies, right? So first we start with downtown and Mechanicsville. So anybody from living downtown, around downtown, Old Fourth Ward. Okay, downtown's not represented, but we love you. Anybody from Central Atlanta Progress in the building? All right, Central Atlanta Progress, right. All right, Central CAP's in the building. There you go, Curly. And then we think about the entirety of the Bankhead corridor or the Hollowell Parkway corridor for my new Atlantans. That's English Avenue and Vine City. That's the Grove Park. So stand up when you hear your area, English Avenue, Vine City. English Avenue, Vine City. All right, we know y'all ain't here. We are in your neighborhood. English Avenue, Vine City, Grove Park, and the work of the Grove Park Foundation. If you're here, then we call West Hollowell. And so West Hollowell, if you live in Collier Heights, Cary Park, Gun Club Park, that's you. Our friends along the Campbellton Road corridor, East and West Campbellton Road, and then finally Thomasville Heights, and our friends from Focus Community Strategies, and anybody doing work in those areas. All right, yeah, what's up, man? Good to see you.
Thank you,
Marv's
Courtney.
in the back.
And we also had a few folks on this side of the column. I know it's hard sometimes to see everybody, but certainly people on this other side of the room as well.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I can't go through that without shouting out the Atlanta Public Schools Board of Education, who is here. Our new vice chair, Ken Zeff, Dr. Ken Zeff is here. Casey Brock is here. I see our superintendent.
Casey, stand up.
Yeah, wave it. You got to stand up when you get elected.
To see who you are.
Don't miss the moment. Yeah, yeah. Our superintendent is here, Dr. Brian Johnson, as well, or he was here. I think he's behind that pole, but they are incredible partners in this work. And obviously, as Sherry said, just having them at the table, a part of the conversation, is more than half the battle.
Good. So next I'm going to come to Carol. Carol, oftentimes when you say play space, there isn't a way to not mention the other P, which is purpose, P for purpose-built communities. Talk a little bit about purpose-built, your model, and your role in this work.
Yeah, hi everybody. It's so good to be here with you. My name's Carol Naughton. I'm the CEO at Purpose Built Communities, and we work with local leaders to transform neighborhoods so that everyone who lives there can really enjoy everything that this country has to offer. We want to put more people on a pathway to economic mobility and happy, healthy, choice-filled lives. We've learned a lot over the last 15 years that we've started. Our work was really informed by the Hope 6 work and then moved beyond that. Our model is resident-centered, so really working with residents in the community to create a plan that matches their dreams and aspirations. And alongside that group of residents is what we call a community quarterback organization, which is a nonprofit that we think about as almost a community strategist. How do you then create this actionable, financeable plan and then figure out how to execute it? Every purpose-built community will always include high-quality mixed-income housing that will serve families beautifully across income in both rental and home ownership and across age, so from the little itty-bitties all the way to seniors. There'll also be a neighborhood-serving cradle-through-college education pipeline that, again, gets everybody ready, every little genius ready for kindergarten and beyond. Our expectation is that everyone will graduate from high school with a financeable, actionable plan to move forward to the next part of their education. We think about economic vitality at the neighborhood level. There's got to be economics that work in a neighborhood. Where are the stores? Where are the groceries? Where are the businesses? What are the opportunities for entrepreneurship in that neighborhood? And what opportunities do people have for jobs and in their neighborhood, for training in their neighborhood that will allow them to access not just what happens in their neighborhood, but everything that's offered in the city and across the metro. We also think about community health and wellness, which is really the kinds of amenities that everyone wants in their neighborhood that are too often lacking in low-income neighborhoods. We want YMCAs, we want parks, we want opportunities to be together, to congregate in ways that are safe and build community. And it really responded to the social capital idea of really creating opportunities for people across income to get to know one another, to build authentic relationships. If we don't build mixed income housing, we will not create mixed income schools. And that's really that beautiful cauldron where kids have an opportunity to build these lifelong relationships that influence them for the rest of their lives. We work now across the country. We work in 60 neighborhoods with about 30 having met network member standards. And we're delighted to be part of this group. And I think that this is going to be the kind of thing that we're all going to tell our grandchildren about down the road.
And Carol, just in the spirit of Mr. English with the shout outs, I know that you have network members represented in the room here in Atlanta, Eastlake Foundation in the Eastlake community, FCS and Historic South Atlanta and Grove Park Foundation in the West Side.
And we've got folks from Wilmington, Delaware who have come. We've got folks in Augusta who are here to learn, who are on track to become a network member. So this is work that is really resonant right now across the country. I think it was David Brooks who said neighborhoods are units of change, and that was a helpful frame, but we think neighborhoods are engines of change. And if we get it right, those engines can move people forward to create all the opportunities that everyone in this country deserves, and they deserve to have it in the place that they call home.
Thank you, Carol. So as I come to Kathy with my question for Kathy, do me a favor. For all of you who have heard of ACP before, raise your hand. Atlanta Committee for Progress. All right, no shame with what I'm going to ask next. Put your hands back up for a second. Are there any of you who think you could do better than Kathy Waller in explaining what ACP actually does? Okay, so I'm going to ask Kathy to share her pitch on what ACP does.
So good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this work. So Atlanta Committee for Progress is a public-private partnership, as Sherry talked about many times, between corporate, civic, and academic leaders in the city and the mayor. We work on projects that support the city of Atlanta, that are the mayor's initiatives. So we start with what the mayor wants to accomplish, and we work in task force, and we pull ourselves together to support that work. One of which is this initiative that the mayor has, when the mayor declared he wanted Atlanta to be the best place to raise a child, we stepped up to help.
Thank you, Kathy. So I'm going to stay with you. I'm going to keep you in the hot seat for a minute, Kathy. And normally most folks would anticipate that I would ask this question of Courtney, but I'm actually going to ask it of you. So the Neighborhood Reinvestment Initiative isn't the first ever initiative that those of us who've lived in Atlanta, I've been here now 35 years, we've seen things come and go. How might this be different?
So I consider this different because, first of all, we have these very, very strong community organizations that are on the ground working. And then we've got a mayor that comes in and says, I want to be a part of that. I want to lead that. I want Atlanta to be the best place to raise a child. Those two things together are pretty powerful. And then when the mayor said that, ACP, the organization that I am executive director for, stepped up and said, how do we do this? We are in, and we formed a task force of people that are supporting this organization. So, and we already had a task force that was working on workforce development. The mayor said to move that workforce development initiative underneath this neighborhood reinvestment initiative. And so those pieces are working together, and we stand ready to support an organization that we will set up that will be a separate organization that will be a backbone to support the neighborhood organizations as we are moving this work forward. All of those things together are different. All of those things together are a force that will come together, and we believe, to move this initiative forward.
All right, Carol, I will come to you next. Thinking about the neighborhoods that Courtney listed, and just acknowledging that purpose-built communities has presence in some but not all of those communities, how might purpose-built communities act or operate differently to support this work beyond the places where you actually have boots on the ground?
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing is we have a lot to learn. We've got to hear from the communities. We don't know a lot about some of the neighborhoods that have been listed because we have not before been invited to those neighborhoods. And part of our DNA is only to go where we're invited. So we've got a lot to learn. We've got community leaders to get to know. We've started to meet some of the leaders in the neighborhoods. But that's the first thing. We've got to go and listen and hear from folks about what they want to achieve, what their aspirations for, so we can work with local leaders to help develop that plan. It's going to take a minute. we shouldn't think about this as something that's going to be done in 90 days, right? This is something that will take intention, it'll take relationship building, and developing trust in order to be able to come up with a plan that meets the needs of the community.
Thank you, Carol. Courtney, one of the many nuggets I've taken from Sherry, and certainly from Raj and from Faye, my conversations with our president, is this is long-term, long-time generational work. Without me telling your age, you've lived in Atlanta, you're born and raised in Atlanta. What gives you the confidence that this NRI will yield a different set of results maybe than what we've seen in the past with other efforts?
Well, I think we have seen efforts generate tremendous success at the neighborhood level. I think about the work of the East Lake Foundation. I think about the work of the West Side Future Fund. I think about the work of the Grove Park Foundation. We've never really tried to tackle the problem at scale. And what gives me confidence is that, candidly, when Atlanta tries to tackle problems at scale, we do it. When we think about the work of Maynard Jackson, which generated, yes, the world's busiest and most efficient airport, but he also created the MPU system, which empowered neighborhoods in a really, really powerful way that still lives today. When I think about the work of Ambassador Young and everything he did to make Atlanta an international city, when I think about the work of Mayor Campbell and Mayor Franklin, who opened up the city in tremendous ways and tackled housing and infrastructure and brought the city together, Atlanta has a history, a profound, deep history, going back to the civil rights movement, of tackling the largest problems that we face. And I think economic mobility, or lack thereof, is that challenge. It's in our DNA to tackle big things. It is who we are. It's who we have candidly always been. And so when Atlanta makes up its mind to do a thing, I think without fail, we do that thing. And I think what is different now is that Atlanta has made up its mind that enough is enough. We are tired of being 50 out of 50. You cannot be a person of good conscience. You cannot be a person of good conscience and look at stats like 20-year life expectancy gaps and then walk away and do nothing. If the mayor were here and our pastor were here, he would say love ought to look like something. And when Atlanta makes up its mind, love looks like action. And so that's what I think is different about this moment.
Thank you, Courtney. So as I prepare to ask my last question to Othello, if you have a question, if you will just actually take the mic, because that'll give me a good sense of how much time we need. I'm going to try to leave us 10 minutes for Q&A from the floor. So Othello, one of the things I did not say contextually in the interest of time is that the Arthur M. Blank Family Foundation approved a $75 million grant to increase economic mobility for young people in Georgia. And this work will take place. Thank you. While I was lucky to work on that grant, I share your applause and the pride with Faye and our entire foundation staff. But my question to you is my statement then question, $75 million to increase economic mobility, $75 million over 5 years. That's our 5-year commitment. We have an enduring commitment to young people, as we do to the West Side. And I'm lucky to lead both of those portfolios. But as Blue Meridian Partners thinks about that work for Georgia, I have a two-part question for you. Atlanta is one of those places, and Blue Meridian Partners has a way, you said, of aggregating capital, private and public resources, bringing expertise. As you've selected Atlanta, and you will select 2, maybe 3 other places beyond Atlanta that touch rural communities, I'd love for you to share why Georgia, as you were thinking, Blue Meridian Partners was thinking about the South, and why specifically Atlanta?
Well, I think Courtney answered that question really beautifully a second ago, right, in terms of all the things that exist here uniquely. When you go to a place, when we think about going to places, we think about, what are the assets there, right? And I don't just mean like there are a lot of foundations, there's money there, although that's definitely a part of it. Like Atlanta has an embarrassment of talent, right? Atlanta has people that have long-standing, commitments to social justice and to the upliftment of others. So for us, that's part of it. The other part of it is, if you look at Rise's map, right, and you say that you're an organization that cares about economic mobility and inequity, you can't look at that map and not have a significant presence in the South, Like, there's just no way to do it. So when we look at that map and say we have to be in the South, you can't be in the South and not be in Atlanta, right? And so because it is the engine that makes so much of this part of the country run, right, it is critically important to the overall health of the country. So Atlanta, for a lot of reasons, is a place that we've long had our eye on, and these things take time, right? There's a lot of work between now and then being an actionable plan that actually hits the streets and funds work that hopefully changes people's lives. There's a lot of work that has to be done before we get there. But we feel like we are finding the right group of people, the right group of partners, partnering with, the public sector, with a mayor like Mayor Dickens is unique, right? And so that's an opportunity that we want to capitalize on. We want to take advantage of that. When you think about the historical presence of Purpose Built in this community and their know-how and what they'll be able to share with other people who are starting this work is critical. When you think about Kathy's leadership and having a business sector that takes corporate responsibility seriously, right? Those are factors that make Atlanta such a compelling place for us. When I think about the South more broadly, the disparities that we talked about don't stop at 285, right? They are in all these other places that are full of poor people generally, but black and brown people disproportionately, right, that are facing these economic mobility challenges. And so the South is just of critical strategic importance to us. And, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that you can't do this work. We can't come to Georgia, right? We're based in New York. We can't come to Georgia and be like, hey, we want to do some stuff down here. We're just going to go ahead and do it. We need partners. We need partnership like the Blank Foundation, right? Folks that have deep roots in this community and a deep knowledge of how to connect with this community. So the partnership with the Blank Foundation, Faye, everybody at your organization has been fantastic. And that's what allows us really to pursue our goals around scale and economic mobility. We can't come down to Georgia and Atlanta and not have a partner that really understands how this place works.
Thank you for that, Othello.